perfect Saturday when we kick off our training shoes and step on Shadiversity's turf. Mine's bigger. Today, I feel my English heritage taking over as we take a glance at this class of warriors that are known universally for their sense of honour, duty, and that other gory stuff that no one likes to mention. Knights!
It's not uncommon to have heard stories as a child of knights in shining armour, saving princesses from towers, vanquishing evil beasts, and riding off into the sunset. From the legends of King Arthur and the Land of Camelot, to classic Disney films such as Sleeping Beauty. But all of this has seen a recent shift, in light of a society that asks if these roles are all that can exist. Should boys be just the courageous knight, or can girls wield a sword too? Why can't boys require saving too? Especially as the ways of knights are still being practiced in the form of light entertainment, or on certain lesser YouTube channels.
I just have it out for you today, man, I'm sorry.
Well, with all that in mind, it may be important to look at the history of these fantastical figures and find out where this idea came from. What started this idea of chivalry to begin with, and how does that factor in today's world?
Let's pull this sword of knowledge out from its stone and take a closer look. His is bigger, isn't it? Yeah.
Our tale begins back in the 8th century, square in the middle of the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages were basically the immediate period after the fall of the Roman Empire, leading to a lot of warring over territory, as well as when little to no written documentation can be found, at least in Europe. The Arabian world is a different matter, as they saved a lot of Greek and Roman texts, which is why we have them today. Just a quick aside, it was during this time that Charlemagne, the Frank Emperor, swept through Europe, claiming territories including northern Spain, Italy, France, Germany, and Poland. These territories were, a lot to maintain, so Charlemagne forged a system to maintain order. This was the feudal system, a class system with Charlemagne, or the ruling monarch at the top, and nobles governing the local territories and maintaining order. This was the time of the early knights. Knights were professional warriors and soldiers that would serve as the muscle to conquer territories or serve as protection for the nobles and monarch. Knights sat under nobles in the feudal system, being gifted with land and wealth, but not as powerful as the lords. The knights also had multiple revenue streams in the form of serfs. Serfs were the last on the chain for the feudal system, lending the land and bringing in money for the knights through trading of wheat and goods. These positions were not fixed, however. If you were born a serf, you could become a knight, and knights could advance to lordship. There was room for advancement.
From here, we move out to the Dark Ages in about 1000 AD, and we move on to 1066. Anyone recognize this year? You might do. A tiny little skirmish is going on right this moment, called the Battle of Hastings.
In brief, the Anglo-Saxon king Harold dies by an arrow through the eye and is supplanted by the Norman baron William, due to the whole dying thing. William the Conqueror is crowned King of England and begins the modern monarchy that us Brits know and joke about today. This is where we can speculate and say that William brought the concept of knights with him, as Anglo-Saxon England was more made up of Celts and Norse integration. Harold was even a Viking king.
And quite easy on the eyes too. You get it? Because he got the arrow. Never mind.
From here we move on from the early medieval period to the middle medieval period, with the Crusades. The Crusades began in 1095 or 1096, after Pope Urban II politely wanted to claim the Holy Land of Jerusalem for the Roman Catholic Church, and asked everyone to fight to claim it, in exchange for a ticket straight to heaven. Liking the sound of that deal, many travelled to the Holy Land and died on the way. It was also around this time that we see factions of knights were formed for specific purposes, or for the specific protection of sites that were deemed important, or were just more into the whole Christianity thing, such as the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Order of St. Lazarus. But crucially, when we get to 1189 and the Third Crusade,
yes, 2 more people thought this was a good idea.
King Richard I throws his crown into the ring and brings many knights with him, and money. And as a knight himself, Richard the Lionheart fights for the Holy Land and eventually organizes a treaty with King Saladin in 1192, leading to peace in their time, and then a load more crusades that ultimately do nothing.
What the hell was that?
By 1100, we reach the late medieval period, and you know what that means? The Renaissance! Great advancements in art, technology, architecture, literature, and economics. The knights of this period were born into the position, and had the money for greater equipment, leading to the image of knights that we have today, as well as the modern idea of chivalry. And then gunpowder is invented, warfare changes forever, and knights become obsolete on the battlefield, and just become another thing for rich people to gloat about.
With this basic timeline in place, we can begin to go into greater detail and underline a few things, starting with the basic definition of what the word knight actually means.
Its etymology starts with the Anglo-Saxon term knight, or the German version of Gneit, with the Anglo-Saxon translating to boy. As I stated, our modern idea of chivalry began in the late medieval period, that of courage, duty, and protection of the innocent. It makes sense for what amounts to a military force. Police have a similar mantra to serve and protect, most of the time. But how this idea began is not as fantastical as a call from God. It actually began much earlier, from around 1170 to 1220. It basically served as a rulebook to keep the knights in line, as, let's be honest, a load of heavily armed, trained, and moderately powerful soldiers would probably go on one or two benders, with the term for chivalry beginning with the term chevalier, which was another French word for knights, derived from cheval, meaning horse.
Speaking of horses, let's move on to what you all came to learn about: weapons, swords, axes, armor, all that good stuff.
Predominantly, knights fought on horseback, and failing that, served as the cavalry on foot. With this in mind, knights primarily fought using either lances or swords. Lances were basically long poles with a piece of armor at the end. Even if it wasn't sharp, it would still hurt to be hit in the chest by one, and would probably still cause bone breaks, internal bleeding, multi-organ failure. Anyway, the modern jousting we have, though used for entertainment and pageantry today, was used at the time for training and practice to get used to steering a horse while holding a giant-ass pole.
Innuendos aside, it's sword time!
The sword most commonly associated with knights is the crossguard longsword. The crossguard has the obvious advantage of guarding the hand, but it also served as a crucifix during religious services or when burying a knight. But there are a few different versions of these swords, each with their own advantages and disadvantages. The first is called a greatsword, or a sword of war, with a channel running up the length of the blade on both sides, making it lighter, and with an edge on both sides of the blade. These swords reached up to 1 meter in length, certainly giving them range and making them great for slashing attacks on horseback. Another is one with the channel running up 3/4 of the blade center, making the end heavier, which actually would increase the force of the sword's attacks. This sword was the most common until the 13th century. The next one is called the bastard sword. And no, this one is not given to all bastards at birth. The bastard sword, or the hand and a half sword, has a larger and broader blade, which is wider at the hilt, with the channel running only halfway up the blade and an average grip of 15 to 23 centimeters, or 5.9 to 9 inches, making it far more difficult to grip with both hands. The last one we'll talk about is one with a flattened diamond cross-section and a pronounced tapering, which was only used from 1280. It had a 16 centimeter grip and was designed to pierce plated armor, or as a thrusting weapon, unlike the other swords we've discussed that were more for slashing, as you didn't have time to precisely stab someone on a moving horse. There was also a dull blade closer to the hilt for extra grip.
I mentioned the greater need of piercing weapons in the wake of plated armor, so let's talk about that.
The first actual armor the knights had was chainmail, which appeared in the 9th century. Man, I would hate to see the knights before that.
It's but a scratch. A scratch? Your arm's off. No, it isn't.
Chainmail is made up of interlocking iron rings that are held together using ringlets. This armor was good to protect against those slashing attacks, but it was not as effective for piercing weapons such as arrows at a closer range or the pointy end of a sword, which is here. This armor did not actually protect against bruising from those slashes or bone breaks and could cause an infection if it touched an open wound. But padding was worn underneath the mail, so there was extra protection from piercing weapons. This armor was also heavy, weighing in at 13.5 kilograms or 30 pounds. Most of this weight was concentrated on the shoulders, but could be lessened by wearing a belt or by having a shorter cut around the body and arms. But that offered less protection. It's not until the 14th century that we get to the plated armor thanks to all that money, with the torso plate being most common, while the whole thing was used less and less on the battlefield as time went on and became more of a collector's item. Last up is two weapons that I'll discuss briefly. First up is the mace, which was used more when armor became more resistant to slashing attacks, leaving the strategy to be hit it until it falls over. The spiked variation of the mace is known as the Morning Star and had a copper alloy head, most commonly, but moved into iron/steel in the 14th century. A strap was added to the hilt to make the thing more difficult to lose after a long night of drinks and you wake up married to a lamp with a tattoo of a monkey's paw on your ass.
I assume.
The flail is the version of the mace with a chain between the hilt and the head. It was developed in the 13th century and was hardly used. My experience with nunchucks can draw some guesses. Finally, we reach the shield. Shield shapes can have as much variation as assorted cornflakes, with the most common one used by knights being the kite shield. Kite shields were built with protection of the whole body in mind, as their large shape can guard the whole body rather than just the torso, Steve. But unsurprisingly, these kite shields can be quite heavy, so a lighter, smaller one can be found as well, with less defensive covering but more maneuverability.
With all that in mind, now comes the time to ask the question, why are knights still so fondly remembered?
First of all, most of their regard, I think, is in regards to status. Despite their position in the pecking order being one away from peasant, they still had influence and regard, and as time went on, those knights born into the position gained a greater amount of hubris, and demanded recognition for doing nothing at all, profiting from their ancestors that actually worked for their positions. Another reason I think is that knights are a cornerstone of English cultural identity. They've been around at least since William the Conqueror, and so that idea of heavily armoured warriors that are trained to kill yet uphold the ideals of the country is one that has pervaded generations. And when something has been around for that long, we kind of stop questioning it. Why is praying a thing? Why do we celebrate a bunch of people that do nothing yet are a height of society? Why are toilet paper? That's just how it's done. There's a security in these things, and asking questions around it is kind of unnerving for those that identify with that ideal so much. Maybe that's why most fiction that prods the concept comes from countries outside of the culture, having an outside perspective on it.
But come to think of it, maybe the idea of knights is not as limited to one country as we may think. Looking at you, Samurai. Thank you for watching this week's video. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss a new video. And until next time, everyone, peace be with you.